All right, let's dive into React effects. I feel like every React developer has a love-hate relationship with these things.
Oh, absolutely. Effects, they're super powerful, but I think sometimes we reach for them a little too quickly.
Yeah, it's like they're tempting, right? Like, oh, I need to do something side effecty. I'll just throw an effect at it.
Right, like it's the easy button.
But the sources that you shared, they really drove home the point that often simpler is better when it comes to effects.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is how often we can achieve the same thing, maybe even better, by really leaning into how React wants to work, like
Yeah.
embracing its rendering life cycle.
Totally. It's like that aha moment when you realize you can just handle something directly in the component's rendering logic instead of reaching for an effect.
Right, like you're working with React, not against it.
Exactly. And React rewards you for it. Your code's cleaner, it's more efficient, and users get that nice, snappy performance.
Totally. Take filtering a list of items, for example. Like using an effect for that seems intuitive, but you're essentially making React do the work twice,
Yes,
right?
yeah, you're forcing those unnecessary re-renders.
Exactly. But if you handle that filtering right there in the render logic, you're letting React do what it does best, efficiently updating the UI.
So we're talking about trusting React to do its job, not micromanaging it with effects for every little change.
Right. And another place this micromanaging with effects often pops up is handling user events.
Oh yeah, like when you have a button click and you need to make an API call or update some other part of your app state.
Exactly. And it's so tempting to just throw all that logic into an effect, but it's actually way more efficient and less error prone to handle it right there in the event handler itself.
Right, because then your logic is directly tied to that specific action.
Exactly. If you put that logic in an effect, you might accidentally trigger it multiple times or at the wrong time.
And as we all know, debugging those timing issues with effects can be a real headache.
Absolutely. It's like trying to untangle a string of Christmas lights. The more you pull, the worse it gets.
Okay, so we've talked about data transformations and user events, but what about those really intensive calculations that can slow our apps down? We can't just lump those into the rendering process, can we?
You're right. That's where our good friend Use Memo comes in.
Use memo. It's like a secret weapon for optimization.
Exactly. It's like having a cache for those expensive operations.
So if I'm understanding this right, instead of recalculating something every time the component renders, use memo lets us store the result and reuse it if the inputs haven't changed.
Precisely. And the beauty is that React handles all the caching logic for you. You just tell it what to cache and when to invalidate it.
That's super handy. It's like having a personal assistant to handle those heavy calculations so the rest of our app can stay snappy.
Right. It's all about working smarter, not harder.
I love that. Now let's talk about state management for a bit. It seems like effects are often used to reset or adjust state when prompts change, but I'm sensing that there are often more elegant, React-approved ways to handle these situations.
Oh, definitely. Using an effect for state management can get really messy really fast.
Okay, so can you give me an example? Like what I might be tempted to reach for an effect, but a better approach exists.
Sure. Let's say you've got a component that displays user profiles, each with its own comment section, and you're using a state variable to manage the text of the comment being typed.
Okay, so as the user types, you're updating that state variable.
Right. Now imagine the user navigates to a different user profile. What happens to the comment they were typing?
Oh, I've totally experienced that as a user, where the comment field doesn't clear and you accidentally post on the wrong profile.
Exactly. That's a terrible user experience. Now, a common way to handle this is to use an effect to reset that comment state every time the user trop changes.
Makes sense. New profile, clear the comment.
Right. But there's a more elegant solution built right into React. The key prop.
Okay, I'm familiar with key, but usually in the context of lists. How does that apply to a user profile?
So if you give each instance of your profile component a unique key, let's say using the user ID, you're signaling to React that each of these profiles is distinct.
Ah, I see. So React sees the new key and thinks, okay, this must be a brand new comment section. Time for a fresh start.
Exactly. And React handles it automatically. No effects, no manual state resets, nothing. It just works.
That is so cool. I love how React often has these built-in solutions that can save us from writing a bunch of extra code.
Right. And it usually leads to a cleaner and more performant app in the end.
Absolutely. That key prop trick is so clever. It's a good reminder that React often has these built-in mechanisms that can save us from over-engineering things with effects.
It's all about working smarter, not harder. And this whole idea of letting React do its thing, it extends to those situations where you might need to adjust part of your state based on prop changes rather than a complete reset.
Okay, I'm intrigued. When would we want to do a partial state update like that?
Let's say you have a component that shows a list of items, and you're keeping track of which item is currently selected. Now, if that list of items changes, like you're fetching data from an API, you need to make sure your selection logic still makes sense.
Right, we don't want to end up with a selected item that's not even in the list anymore. That would be bad.
Exactly. Now, you might be tempted to use an effect here watch for changes to the item's prop and update the selected item state accordingly. But there's a more efficient way to handle this right there in our rendering logic, using the previous state pattern.
Previous state pattern. Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me.
So instead of using an effect to react after the state has updated, we're going to be proactive. We'll store the previous item's prop in its own state variable.
Okay, so we have a snapshot of the previous list. Got it.
Right. Then, during rendering, we compare the current items to the previous items. If they're different, boom, we know the list has changed, and we can update selected item if we need to.
So we're basically short-circuiting that update process. Instead of waiting for an effect to fire after rendering, potentially causing another re-render, we're handling it right then and there.
Exactly. Less re-renders, smoother performance, happier users. But, a word of caution here. While this pattern can be super useful, don't go overboard. Overusing it can make your code harder to follow. Always see if you can calculate things directly during rendering or lift state up to a parent component first.
So it's a powerful tool, but like any tool, use it strategically. Now, switching gears a bit, what are some clear signs that an effect is the right tool for the job? Like when should we reach for it without hesitation?
One of the most common scenarios is when you need to synchronize your component with some external system, something that's outside the React world.
Give me some examples of these external systems.
Think third-party libraries, browser APIs, or server-side data sources. Anything that React doesn't directly control, but your component needs to interact with.
So an effect acts as the bridge between our React component and the outside world.
Exactly. A classic example is fetching data from an API. An effect is a perfect fit for that. You can make that API request as soon as the component mounts. But, and this is super important, always include proper cleanup logic in your data fetching effects.
Cleanup logic. Why is that so important when we're talking about API requests?
Imagine the user navigates away from the component before that API request finishes. Without cleanup logic, you risk that old request trying to update the state after the component is gone. That's how you get those nasty race conditions and weird bugs that make you want to pull your hair out.
So cleanup logic is like saying, hey, old request, we're done here, you can stand down.
Precisely. It prevents those zombie requests from wreaking havoc on your app. Now, while effects are commonly used for fetching data, React actually provides a more specialized hook for syncing with external data. Use Sync External Store.
Oh yeah, use Sync External Store. I've seen it mentioned, but I haven't had a chance to dive in. What's so special about it?
This hook is designed specifically for those situations where you need to keep your UI perfectly in sync with an external data source. Like imagine you're building a real-time chat app or a game where those external updates need to be reflected instantly.
So if we're dealing with external data that needs to be reflected in our UI as smoothly as possible, use Sync External Store is the way to go.
Absolutely. It handles all the tricky stuff for you, subscribing to the data source, handling updates, even optimizing performance. It's way more robust and less error-prone than trying to write all that logic yourself within an effect.
Sounds like a lifesaver. Now, we've talked about syncing with external systems, but what about those times when we need to update state based on changes to other parts of our state, like a chain reaction of updates within our component?
Ah, yes, the dreaded chain of
It
effects.
seems like that could easily spiral out of control. One update triggers another, which triggers another, and suddenly you have this tangled mess on your hands.
And a performance nightmare to go with it. It's like those domino chain reactions, except instead of cool patterns, you get bugs and slowdowns.
So how do we avoid creating these chains of effects in the first place? It seems like sometimes multiple things do need to update in response to a single action.
It's all about planning ahead and consolidating your logic. Instead of relying on a chain reaction of effects, try to calculate as much of your state up front as possible right there in the initial rendering process.
So like batching those updates together.
Exactly. And if you do need to update multiple pieces of state, try to group those updates within a single event handler.
So rather than each state update causing a re-render and potentially triggering another effect, we're being smart about it and updating everything in one go.
Right. Your code will be cleaner, it'll perform better, and you'll thank yourself when it comes time to debug.
It's like we're optimizing those updates for maximum efficiency. Speaking of efficiency, let's talk about those tasks that only need to happen once when the app loads, like fetching initial settings or maybe checking if the user's authenticated.
Right. And I know it's tempting to just slap an empty dependency array on an effect and call it a day.
Oh, you know me too well. It's like the quick and dirty solution.
It might seem like it works, but it can actually cause subtle issues, especially during development. Remember how we talked about effects potentially running twice in strict mode?
Right, because strict mode is like React's way of double-checking our work, making sure our components can handle being mounted and unmounted.
Exactly. So even if your effect looks like it's only running once in production, that empty dependency array can create inconsistencies between development and production, and those can be a real pain to track down.
That makes a lot of sense. So if relying on an effect with an empty dependency array for initialization isn't ideal, what's the best way to handle these one-time setup tasks?
Instead of forcing it into the component lifecycle, think about where that initialization logic really belongs. A lot of times you can just handle it right in your module's initialization code, like right up there at the top level, before you even define your components.
So if I'm fetching an auth token when the app loads, I could just do that in my main application file outside of any React component.
Exactly. That way it runs once, and only once, when the module loads, no matter what mode you're in. Plus, it keeps your initialization logic separate from your component logic, which makes your code easier to understand.
It's like setting the stage before the play even starts. Everything's in its right place from the get-go.
I like that analogy. Now let's touch on one last thing when it comes to effects. Communication between parent and child components, specifically the whole idea of child components updating their parent's state directly.
Yeah, that always feels a bit off, like the child is overstepping its boundaries.
It definitely makes your data flow harder to follow.
Hmm.
It's much cleaner to let data flow down the component tree from parent to child. If a child needs to update something, it should communicate that need up to its parent, who can then update its own state and pass the changes back down.
So it's more of a request from the child rather than a demand.
Exactly. And that's where misuse of effects can sometimes sneak in. If you ever find yourself writing an effect in a child component that directly updates its parent state, that's a big red flag. It's a sign that you might need to rethink how your data is structured or how your components are talking to each other.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We've busted some myths about effects, discovered some really elegant ways to make our code more efficient, and even uncovered some hidden gems in React.
It's all about understanding the tools and knowing when to use them effectively. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one.
I couldn't agree more. So to all our listeners out there, go forth and write clean, efficient React code. And until next time on the deep dive, happy coding.